We've all seen Vikings in movies and on television, but popular portrayals of this ancient culture are often far from historical reality. In truth, a Viking man was usually a farmer during the day, while his wife managed the household and cared for the family. At night, everyone slept together in a single large room, including the children and, quite often, their goats. Probably not what most people imagine when they hear the word Vikings. All right, let's take a look at the Minnesota Vikings. Viking culture could be extremely brutal. They were infamous for raiding their enemies, and part of the spoils included prisoners who were taken back to Scandinavia and sold as slaves, known as thralls. Viking warriors sailed across Europe, attacking regions from Spain all the way to Byzantium. Along their routes, they traded prisoners, especially women, through a well-organized slavery network. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous iron slave collars and evidence that suggests the presence of forced labor farms in Sweden. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, human sacrifice also played a role in their beliefs. Mass grave sites discovered throughout Scandinavia appear to confirm reports from Christian chroniclers, who describe violent rituals carried out in the name of the gods. It's no surprise that people were terrified of Viking raids. While the idea that Vikings wore horned helmets is just a myth, the famous Viking funeral was very real. Well-known warriors would have their bodies placed on a ship, which could range in size from a small rowing boat to a huge war vessel. The ship would be filled with so-called grave goods, important belongings the dead were believed to need in the afterlife. These items could include jewelry, animals, weapons, and, most disturbingly, living slaves who belonged to the deceased. Once everything was prepared, the ship, most likely still on land, would be set on fire, sending the warrior off in a literal blaze of glory. While this honor was most often given to men, it's important to note that a number of women received the same treatment as well. In the 10th century, a writer named Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed a funeral that closely resembled one of these ship burials. He recorded that for wealthy individuals of high status, 1/3 of their property was passed on to their family, another third was used to pay for burial clothing, and the final third went toward purchasing alcoholic drinks served during the cremation. There's truly no party like a Viking funeral party. You may already know this, but winters in Scandinavia can be extremely cold. The freezing winter made the ground icy and traveling tricky. But when your daily life depended on hunting, as it often did for Vikings, a little ice couldn't hold you back. So how did the Vikings handle it? Archaeologists believe they simply slid across the ice. This is supported by the discovery of over 100 pine wood skis preserved in bogs. Worth noting, no Viking lift ticket has ever been found. Evidence also shows that Vikings used ice skates made from moose or horse bones, and wooden sleighs have been found in the graves of high-status Viking women. When it comes to hairstyles, Vikings are not particularly famous, and there's a reason for that. They wore reverse mullets. Yes, when they first arrived in England, locals couldn't help but notice the party in the front, business in the back look. This hairstyle became unpopular, especially with the church, but it would resurface in later generations among the Norman invaders, who were descendants of the Vikings. Viking houses usually consisted of just one big room, and families often shared their living space with animals. Some homes were built with 2 rooms, likely to prevent the occupants from being trampled by goats while they slept. These larger homes were typically owned by wealthier members of Viking society. As time went on and Viking culture developed, the richest Vikings built increasingly bigger houses with more space. These homes were designed to comfortably shelter people, livestock, and stored food. The largest room in these buildings was known as the Longhouse. It would usually include a central hearth and a cooking pit, and it served as a communal hall. While Viking women could be chiefs or renowned warriors, most were not. A typical Viking man spent his day working the farm, while the average woman was responsible for managing the household. This included keeping the food stores full, weaving textiles, repairing sails, and generally acting as the authority within the family. Life was not easy for Viking women. Adultery by a wife was considered an extremely serious offense, and in some regions, a Viking man who caught his wife being unfaithful could legally kill both her and her lover. Meanwhile, men were allowed to keep concubines or have children outside of marriage. This practice was so common that some early Christian observers mistakenly believed the Vikings practiced polygamy. Despite this imbalance, women did have certain legal rights. Viking women were permitted to divorce their husbands if they chose to. Evidence suggests that this rarely used process was surprisingly simple, requiring only the gathering of witnesses and a public declaration of divorce. While the process could become more complicated when property ownership was involved, the very fact that divorce was possible is quite remarkable. For entertainment, Viking men and women played a board game called Hnefatafl. Hnefatafl was a Germanic strategy game, similar to chess, and is believed to have developed from an earlier Roman game. They also played regular chess. The British Museum houses a famous 12th century Norwegian chess set, known as the Lewis Chessman. These pieces were carved from walrus ivory and whale teeth, and represent one of the few nearly complete medieval chess sets still in existence today. Hnefatafl was deeply woven into Viking culture and history. It frequently appeared in Norse sagas, often being played by heroes and kings. One example can be found in the saga of King Olaf the Saint. This poem describes a game between two real historical figures, Nut the Great, who ruled England, Norway, and Denmark, and one of his nobles, a man named Ulf. Vikings were not illiterate. In fact, they were able to write using a runic alphabet known as Futhark, which was used by both men and women. Futhark consisted of 24 letters and could be used to write several Germanic languages. Interestingly, Futhark runes have been discovered carved into stones across northern Europe, and archaeologists believe this practice may have held mystical significance. Like all cultures, Vikings loved listening to stories. They even had professional storytellers known as skalds. Much like the oral poets of ancient Greece, skalds memorized long stories and performed them aloud around a fire or inside a great hall. These tales were entertaining, but they also helped teach younger generations about Viking culture, beliefs, and history. Skalds were particularly associated with royal courts, where it's believed they honored their rulers by placing them within legendary family lines. Thanks to an Old Norse book called the Skaldatal, we know the names of roughly 300 skalds who lived between 800 and 1200 AD. Their poems were filled with literary devices known as kennings. Kennings were short descriptive phrases that created vivid imagery without forcing the poet to repeat the same words. For example, instead of saying death, a skald might use the phrase the sword's sleep. In the 13th century, an Icelandic scholar named Snorri Sturluson wrote a handbook designed to explain the meanings behind these skaldic kennings. Because understanding many of them required knowledge of Norse mythology, Snorri also recorded the myths themselves. Much of what we know about Norse mythology today survives only because of his writings. Evidence suggests that nearly all Vikings, regardless of social status, ate a protein-heavy diet. In fact, during the Middle Ages, even the poorest Viking likely ate better than the average English peasant. A typical Viking family usually ate 2 meals a day, one in the morning after waking up, and another once the day's work was finished. Meat was a regular part of their diet and included goat, reindeer, elk, lamb, beef, mutton, horse, and, thanks to the impressive skills of Viking hunters, even bear on occasion. Pigs were raised on both farms and large estates, making pork especially popular. Most Viking meat dishes were boiled. One dish, known as scouse, was a thick stew often enjoyed with bread baked from beans, grains, and even tree bark. For a seafaring culture, it's no surprise that fish was also a major food source. Herring was widely eaten and prepared in many ways, including pickled, dried, salted, or smoked. But the Viking diet wasn't only meat-based. It was fairly balanced and included fruits and vegetables as well. Evidence shows they consumed carrots, beans, cabbage, and apples. They also used herbs and spices such as cumin, mustard, coriander, and horseradish to add flavor to otherwise bland meals. Despite this hearty diet, Vikings still faced several health issues. Archaeological excavations of Viking sewers and cesspools reveal that many suffered from intestinal parasites. As if that weren't unpleasant enough, the same evidence suggests that Viking bread was sometimes contaminated with seeds from weeds that are poisonous to humans. Today, most of us enjoy a good beer, but Vikings preferred an early predecessor known as mead. Mead was made by fermenting water, honey, and yeast. It was especially popular at feasts and was believed to inspire great poetry. Mead was so important to Viking culture that Norse mythology even includes a character named Hydrun, a magical goat that produces mead instead of milk. Vikings loved to celebrate, and their feasts were massive events overflowing with food. A feast was usually held inside a large longhouse and hosted by someone of importance, such as a local chieftain or king. These gatherings were often held to mark an occasion like a harvest festival or religious ritual. But they could also celebrate personal milestones, such as a wedding, the birth of a child, or even a successful raid. While the food was certainly important, it wasn't the main purpose of these feasts. More than anything, they served as a way to strengthen social bonds. Leaders and followers could build relationships, political roles were reinforced, and alliances were formed, all of which were essential to maintaining Viking society and culture. How do you think you'd handle life as a Viking? Let us know in the comments below.